How's it going, everybody? My name is John, and welcome back to part 2 of Oversimplified's fantastic series on the Napoleonic Wars, the series that got me interested in the Napoleonic Wars. If you guys haven't seen part 1 that was uploaded on the channel a couple of days ago, we're finally here back with part 2. As we left off, Napoleon had just won the war of the Fourth Coalition, beating the Russians and Prussians at Friedland, and is basically now the master of Europe. So part 2 is going to go into his downfall amongst a slew of other conflicts that arose around this time. So without further ado, let's jump right back into it.
After the Third and Fourth Coalition Wars, Napoleon had decisively defeated all three of his main rivals on the continent, and he was now undoubtedly the master of Europe. After the Battle of Friedland, his enemies sued for peace, and they all met on a raft on a river for negotiations. They had been fighting for the past 4 years, but now Napoleon and Alexander surprisingly got along like a house on fire.
You know, the Treaty of Tilsit was actually a little bit of foreshadowing how Napoleon and Alexander had a level of respect for each other. And Alexander, even after he went into Paris, because it was the Russians who first entered Paris after defeating Napoleon in 1814, or rather avoiding him to get to Paris in 1814 to force him to abdicate. In the Congress of Vienna, which was the peace treaty that started after 1814, continued through the 100 Days campaign that led into Waterloo, and then went on through 1816, Emperor Alexander was actually the person in 1814 who allowed Napoleon to keep his title of emperor. Up to that point, the British hadn't acknowledged that Napoleon was an emperor of Paris. They haven't acknowledged that. So when Alexander signed that treaty, he royally peeved off the British, who had never acknowledged that he was emperor, and now they had to acknowledge him as a legitimate leader, because the British wanted to send him something more akin to his second exile rather than his first. But it was Alexander's grateful treatment that allowed Napoleon to be the Emperor of Elba.
Together, they chatted long into the night. They kissed. The two had a lot of mutual respect, and Napoleon even told his wife that if Alexander were a woman, I would make him my mistress. Kind of a weird thing to say to your wife, Napoleon.
I agree.
In the end, they came to an amicable agreement. Russia would lose barely any land, and in return, they'd join France against the UK and invade Sweden. Win-win. On the other hand, Frederick William III was sidelined, and Prussia lost an enormous amount of territory to French client states. Only the UK remained as the last major threat to Napoleon, and
Napoleon creating the Duchy of Warsaw was a big deal, and that would further complicate things during the Congress of Vienna when the four major superpowers, being Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, tried to come to peace terms. Prussia and Russia both wanted their own pieces of Poland, while the English and the Austrians were more so for a independent Poland and to bring Poland back as a country. Poland, which had been previously partitioned by Prussia, Austria, and Russia, basically, well, not basically, literally until it didn't exist on the map anymore. So Napoleon creating the Duchy of Warsaw was a big deal and basically paved the way for the Polish people to get their state back. And now we have the country of Poland in Europe, but that didn't exist at that time. And it sowed a lot of rivalry when it came to the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon was firmly defeated.
Continued to be a big thorn in his side, constantly funding his enemies and using their powerful navy to wreak havoc on French trade and overseas colonies. But what could Napoleon do? The British were safe across the channel. Well, he said, if I can't fight you with guns, I'll fight you with money. Earlier in 1806, Napoleon had announced the Continental System, a total shutoff of the UK from continental trade. No one in Europe was to trade with Britain, and Napoleon hoped that by hitting their economy, he could force them to negotiate. The British economy did take a hit, and they responded in their typical fashion, by going to Copenhagen and blowing a bunch of stuff up.
See, the British were not innocent when it came to all these wars. This is the second time that they randomly bombed Copenhagen for essentially no reason, other than to disrupt French trade, which the Dutch didn't really have much to do with.
In general, the British managed to stay afloat by simply increasing their trade with other parts of the world. Many neutral countries found themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place as the two European superpowers demanded they cease trade with the enemy. Hey America, you better not trade with the French or else I'll come burn down the White House. What? This is gonna wreck my economy. I need to start saving money. How the heck am I
I
going to
have to
start
skip
saving
the
money?
ad. It's for a company that did something pretty bad. If you know, you know. So we are going to skip the ad for this one as well. There's the name of the company, just in case you were wondering.
Sick of being blown up for doing almost nothing, and under significant pressure from Napoleon, the Danish officially sided with France. But Napoleon's blockade
So
had
yeah,
biggest
the
effect
British
on continental
blowing
Europe.
up Copenhagen for essentially no reason actually pushed the entire country of Norway to end up forming an alliance with Napoleon. So the British were not innocent when it came to all this stuff.
Who were now cut off from a major trading partner, one that controlled the seas and held a rich, growing empire. And a lot of countries didn't fully comply. Portugal, a traditional British ally, refused to take part. No problem. Napoleon sent an army and invaded. But it wasn't just Portugal. Many of Napoleon's allies were also...
So that's when the War of the Peninsula starts, and I figured they're about to get into the fact that Spain was also defying the continental system. But if Napoleon would have just let it go at Portugal, the continental system is a good idea in theory because the British were hell-bent on defeating him. But the reality was, with Napoleon being as dominant as he was on land combat, they couldn't really do much to stop Napoleon. He had too many allies all the way from Russia to Spain that were still trading with him. They couldn't do a full blockade of the entire continent of Europe. That would be infeasible for even the US Navy of today in 2026 to pull off, to do an entire blockade of the entire continent of Europe, all the way from Eastern Russia, which connects to Asia, all the way to France. It would not be possible. The continental system's a good idea in theory, and like they mentioned, it did hurt the British economy. But the reality is Britain had the biggest empire in the world and a navy to back it up. So it hurt the other countries a lot more than it hurt Britain.
Effect. Your Majesty, it seems that Spain isn't properly enforcing your blockade. Spain? Why not? Well, it appears they've been trying to find a way out of being your ally since they lost their fleet at Trafalgar. What is with these people? It's almost like everyone's only pretending to be my ally because they know otherwise I'd beat them up. Do I even have any real friends? Are you my friend, Pierre? Say yes or I'll slap you. Napoleon had come to mistrust his ally to the south. And in particular, Napoleon thought the Spanish royal family were an incompetent mess. All right, Carlos, you've got to get it together. How can I trust you when all you do is go hunting? Meanwhile, you let this ambitious nobody who dislikes me run the country. And you seem to be the only person in the universe who doesn't realize he's boinking your wife. And what's worse... Who the heck are you?
The person that Napoleon, the animated Napoleon, said was running the country was Manuel Godoy. And Manuel Godoy made a deal with Napoleon after Napoleon appointed himself the king. And after the French occupied Spain, when the Spanish rebelled, they actually... I don't know how they executed Manuel Godoy. I don't know if they hung him. I don't know if they beat him to death. But they did take out Manuel Godoy afterwards. So that deal ended up not paying off for Manuel Godoy.
I'm the king's son. I just overthrew my dad. So, actually, now I'm the king. You people are the biggest cluster of shameless, narcissistic idiots and all around just the worst people I've ever met. Here, have a Kid's Choice Award. French forces, many having conveniently already entered Spain to invade Portugal, occupied Spanish forts, and Napoleon invited the Spanish royals to France to help mediate their differences. All right, we're here with the
Dr.
royal
Phil
family of
parody.
Spain. So, Fernando, you've been accused of plotting against your father and vying for the Spanish throne.
Which he was.
What do you have to say for yourself? Well, Napoleon, I just think great. Well, I've got the test results right here. Fernando, in the case of the Spanish throne, you are not the king. And Carlos, you are also not the king. I'm the king.
This is where Napoleon's ambition took him too far. Ruling over Spanish, or having Spain have French rule, because Napoleon actually appointed his older brother Joseph, his only older brother Joseph, to be the king of Spain. And yeah, that was a bad idea. The Spanish people did not like the idea of having a French ruler at all. They despised it. And the Spanish people never really conformed to the French rule. And they actually made the term guerrilla warfare because the Spanish that fought back against the French were known as guerrillas. And that coined the term guerrilla warfare. And I believe they make the comparison in this video, if I'm not mistaken, but Spain ended up being Napoleon's Vietnam, and it was a constant drain from 1809 or 1808, whenever he launched this whole operation in Spain, all the way to the end of Napoleon. They were never able to have full control under Spain, and it cost them hundreds of thousands of men who died from sickness, disease, and then the guerrillas themselves and the remnants of the Spanish army that almost made Spanish a full-on war zone. And then eventually Spain actually, with the instability there, the British were able to land, and that's where the Duke of Wellington comes into the story.
Actually, Napoleon made his brother the king, but for all intents and purposes, Spain was now his puppet. He expected the Spanish people to be over the moon at the removal of their unpopular royal family. Imagine his surprise when it turned out that people don't really like to be subjugated by a foreign power, least of all one who had previously attacked the Catholic Church. And so
that was probably a big part of it. The fact that Spain is a deeply Catholic country, or at least was at that time, and Napoleon had basically booted the Catholic Church and disrespected it multiple times, including his coronation in Notre Dame, where he put the crown on his own head while the Pope was present, because he was normally supposed to crown emperors. Because honestly, as opposed to their weak ruler and the decimation that Spain was in at that time, they probably would have been better under a Napoleonic regime, whether that be Napoleon or his brother. But under French rule, they probably would have been better off, but the Spanish people did not like the fact that they were being ruled by a foreign power.
Revolted. Brutal fighting broke out as bands of armed Spaniards ambushed French troops across the kingdom, and vicious atrocities were committed on both sides. In addition to fighting the regular Spanish and Portuguese forces, the French had to contend with tens of thousands of guerrilla fighters throughout the Spanish countryside. The British even took the opportunity to land an army led by the future Duke of Wellington. And now, British forces were defeating French ones on land. Napoleon briefly went to Spain in person, and he did drive back the Allied armies, but before long, his attention was needed elsewhere. The whole thing became a nightmare for the emperor. He excelled at traditional warfare, but this was something more akin to Napoleon's Vietnam. The whole conflict would keep hundreds of thousands of French soldiers and resources bogged down for years.
7 years, the Peninsular War went on and just drained France of resources. This was the first major expansionist blunder by Napoleon. This is one of the only cases where I agree with people that say Napoleon was under expansionist greed and he was an aggressor. And this Peninsular War, absolutely.
Napoleon was never able to break the will of the Spanish people, and this problem weakened his position in Europe. Hey, Francis, want to go to war with Napoleon again? Oh, I don't know, Britain. He's already whomped me 3 times. I'll give you £1 bazillion. Well, okay. Seeing that Napoleon was now caught up in Spain, and with some British funding, Austria decided maybe, just maybe, this time, they'd have a chance. So did they? No. Napoleon defeated them in just 4 months. It was quick, but it wasn't exactly easy. The Austrians had been watching Napoleon and learning, and they had made some reforms, while Napoleon, after years of war, was increasingly having to rely on inexperienced conscripts.
So this is where you see Napoleon start to falter because of the term of the warfare. Napoleon had a major population pool to pull from, as the other countries were mainly based off of royalty. So that's why you see Archduke Charles leading the Austrian army, or that was the name that popped up on the map. It just so happened to work out that Archduke Charles was actually a very good general, and he was great at leading his men, at least a lot better than the previous Austrian generals. The French Grand Army, or Grande Armée, as I should say, was still miles better than them, but the Austrians, like they said, started implementing their tactics. They started using corps. They started doing more precise flanking maneuvers. They started different formations. And Napoleon actually lost his first battle since being crowned first consul at Aspern and Essling, where Napoleon tried to get his men across pontoon bridges, but the Austrians kept throwing stuff down the bridges, and eventually Napoleon had to retreat. He ended up beating the Austrians at Wagram, but at the end of the day, this was a very costly war for Napoleon, not only because it lost a lot of men and made him rely on even more inexperienced conscripts as opposed to his veterans that had won the wars in Italy and Austerlitz and Friedland, but also because one of Napoleon's best marshals, Marshal Lannes, lost his life in the War of the Fifth Coalition. And he was one of Napoleon's best generals ever, John Land. I highly recommend you do some research into him if you guys have time.
The Austrians gave him a run for his money. The Fifth Coalition saw some of the bloodiest battles to date, including Napoleon's first major defeat. And when he did finally defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram, it was a very costly victory. Still, Napoleon had yet again kicked Francis's butt.
Just to go back to Marshal Land, who lost his life in the War of the Fifth Coalition. I'm not sure if it was at Aspern and Essling or if it was at Wagram, but when Marshal Land lost his life, he witnessed his aide-de-camp, I believe it was his chief of staff, or somebody who was very high-ranking in his battalion or in his corps, had been hit by a cannonball and died on impact. Marshal Land took a second. He sat down. He was like, like kind of gathering himself after watching a dear friend get taken out like that. And then he himself had his legs blasted off by a cannonball. They tried to perform surgery on him. The surgery actually went well, but Marshal Land still lost his life. Had it been 100 years later or modern times and that happened, Marshal Land might have survived. But unfortunately, at that time, he didn't. And Napoleon actually visited him every day in the hospital and cried when Marshal Land finally passed away, and actually wrote a letter to his wife saying that it's as big of a loss for you as it is for me. I lost someone I truly considered to be a friend. And that shows Napoleon's loyalty to those who were close to him.
As part of the peace terms, Austria lost a bunch more land. Not long after, however, Napoleon and Francis came to another agreement. It was decided that Napoleon would marry Francis's young daughter. But wait, doesn't Napoleon already have a wife? Well, yes, he did. Josephine and Napoleon had become quite fond of one another, but now that Napoleon was playing the monarch game, he needed a male heir, and his aging wife wasn't giving him one. So it was out with the old and in with the new. At least he didn't behead anyone.
That was a nice King Henry VIII reference, because notoriously he beheaded, exiled, beheaded. I don't remember the order, but he had like 5 or 6 wives, former ruler of England. But as you can see in this video, they barely mention Josephine. And in the movie, Ridley Scott's Napoleon, they make Napoleon out to be this simp who just did everything and anything for Josephine. But at the end of the day, he was willing to sacrifice his marriage to Josephine for the political climate. He was playing the monarch game, as they say, and he was willing to put down that marriage and marry into an Austrian alliance, just like King Louis XVI did with Marie Antoinette, over his love for Josephine, which, yes, he did love Josephine. One of Napoleon's last words was Josephine. He was talking about his former wife. That was the true love of his life. But was Napoleon falling head over heels for her? Was he willing to compromise the world and his political aspirations for her? Absolutely not.
For Austria, they felt that if Napoleon was going to keep on winning, they may as well be on his side. So through the marriage, Napoleon got an alliance with Austria and a beautiful baby potato.
Napoleon II.
Between the failing blockade against Britain, the ongoing war in Spain, and now his recent struggles in Austria, cracks in Napoleon's invincibility were beginning to show. But still, look at this map. So blue, so beautiful. Even Sweden, after being pulverized by Russia, overthrew their king,
Spain.
And after an interesting chain of events, ended up putting one of Napoleon's own marshals in charge. Marshal Bernadotte took the name Karl Johan and became Crown Prince of Sweden after agreeing to join Napoleon's continental system. For now, Sweden was Team France. Napoleon was...
So with Marshal Bernadotte becoming the King of Sweden, his lineage, after he changed his name to Karl Johan, is actually still on the Swedish throne to this day in 2026. So Marshal Bernadotte's legacy has lasted a very long time. Marshal Bernadotte married into Napoleon's family, I believe, and he was one of Napoleon's marshals, one of his 18 marshals that he appointed in 1804. But through a couple of hazardous actions, I believe he failed to launch a pursuit of enemies in certain instances. He was actually supposed to support Marshal Davout at the Battle of Auerstedt, where Davout was outnumbered almost 2-1, and he failed to do that. So Bernadotte almost got court-martialed. His role and his relationship with Napoleon was always more one of rivalry. When Napoleon staged the coup of 18 Brumaire, Bernadotte actually said that Napoleon would cost himself his life. He said that he will be unalived, as we'll put it in TikTok terms, because YouTube, I don't want them to hinder this video completely. And he completely did not like the idea of Napoleon staging a coup. So he always had a little bit of a rivalry with Napoleon. Napoleon respected his ability, though, and because he was married into Napoleon's family and he was a man of prestige, that's why Sweden picked him. But when Sweden picked Bernadotte to become the ruler, Napoleon literally said there would have been a bunch of other marshals that I would have chose over him, but okay, you do you, because he thought Bernadotte would represent his interests. Little did he know that Bernadotte would be a part of the War of the Six Coalition that ended up defeating Napoleon. And Bernadotte actually went on to beat Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most famous marshals, in a battle that ended up getting towards the end of the war.
Top of the world. He had won an endless string of victories. All he had to do now was sit back and not make any major miscalculations that could completely turn the tide of war. So let's see what comes next.
No.
France's alliance with Russia was a terrifying prospect. Together, the two could have been unstoppable. But unfortunately, the alliance didn't last. The Russians felt they weren't getting a fair deal. Napoleon's Duchy of Warsaw right on their doorstep was a bit of an insult. And then their economy began to...
It wasn't that Napoleon had a border with Russia. That wasn't what upset them, because they had borders with other great powers, including, as you could see on this map, Prussia and Austria. What they didn't like about it was the fact that it was basically another Polish state that they had worked very hard to dismantle with the previous partitions. Poland hadn't been, having been a big rival of Russia. And as they're about to mention, the fact that the continental system was going on hurt the Russian economy far more than it hurt the British economy. So Alexander was in it for himself and said, you know what, we don't need to honor this. Napoleon made a major miscalculation in Spain and in Russia trying to enforce this continental system that ultimately led to his downfall.
Because of Napoleon's British blockade. And eventually, they began to open up trade. Your Majesty, it seems Alexander is no longer abiding by the continental system and has begun trading with the British. Alexander? But he kissed me. He kissed you? You wouldn't get it, Pierre. No one would ever kiss you. The security of Napoleon's empire depended on removing the British threat, and he wasn't happy with Russia's backdoor shenanigans. And so in 1812, Napoleon decided to go to war. He gathered together the most massive army Europe had ever seen, made up of troops from every corner of his empire, and he prepared to invade. Okay, it looks like Napoleon's coming for us. Generals, I need ideas. We could stand and fight. No, that's stupid. You're stupid. We could run away. You're a star. You'll remember Napoleon's tactics relied on astonishing speed to outmaneuver his enemy and force a quick, decisive battle. Well, I've got two words for you. Scorched earth. If his opponent retreated while scorching the earth, his men couldn't live off the land. And if his men couldn't live off the land, he needed his supply trains. And if he needed his supply trains, he couldn't move quickly. And if he...
So yeah, scorched earth was the perfect strategy to defeat Napoleon. And just like with guerrilla warfare, scorched earth was another completely new idea at this time. Like when Napoleon reaches Moscow, for Russia to release their prisoners and burn down their most historic city in Moscow was completely unprecedented. There was no way that Napoleon could have predicted that. He figured that they would sue for peace, just like Prussia did when they reached Berlin, just like Austria did when they reached Vienna multiple times. He figured that they would sue for peace, and it ultimately led to Napoleon's downfall. But a massive misconception about Napoleon's invasion of Russia: Napoleon actually lost more men in the summer in advancing to Moscow than he did on the retreat. It was grueling heat, and many men died of sickness as well as the Battle of Borodino, which I think might have happened in winter. But Napoleon lost more men on his way to Moscow than the retreat back to the border.
quickly, he could not maneuver his enemy. And if he could not maneuver his enemy, I think you get the point. Napoleon launched his invasion and hoped for a quick battle, but all he could do was try to catch the retreating Russians while moving deeper and deeper into hostile territory. As he went, the horribly hot summer...
Like you could see, Napoleon lost, according to the graph that they showed, Napoleon lost almost a third of his army, 200,000 men, before any major battle happened or before they hit any major landmarks or major cities.
His army. His men died of heat, exhaustion, and disease. Supplies began to run out. and his men began to starve. Many deserted, and still the Russians continued to retreat. Numerous times Napoleon considered turning back, but that little voice in his head kept on telling him, keep going, just a little further. And don't worry, you're definitely average height for the time. He nearly caught the Russians at Smolensk, but it was his birthday, so he had a party instead. When he finally reached Moscow, he predicted the Russians wouldn't be willing to give up such a historic and holy city without a fight. And he was right. The Russians finally turned to face him for the single deadliest day.
By the time Napoleon got to the Battle of Borodino that they're about to get into, he had already lost 500,000 men. And this is all before the retreat. So there's a big misconception that Napoleon lost so many men in the retreat and that they all froze to death and that was the major cause. In reality, Napoleon lost most of his men on the way there. And the reason that I think we have this misconception about Napoleon losing men on the retreat is because Germany lost a large portion of their men on the retreat in World War II. It wasn't the same case with Napoleon.
Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Borodino. The Russians fought valiantly, and as he got older, Napoleon's battle tactics seemed to become a little less refined and a little more run straight at the enemy, try not to die. He launched a full frontal assault at the Russian defenses, and as a result, the death toll was colossal. The Russians eventually decided to retreat, leaving Moscow to fall into Napoleon's hands. Quick, the French are taking the city. Release all the...
Napoleon still won Borodino. He lost 30,000 men, but the Russians lost 44,000. So even with his army depleted and a lot of the men that he came with gone, Napoleon was still able to beat the Russian army in a major battle for their capital, essentially. Borodino was the defense of Moscow effectively. So, just going to wait 1 second for them to kind of start balking. But when it came down to Borodino, the reason that the Russians turned around and even fought with Napoleon, their generals didn't actually want to do it. It was two guys, Bennigsen and Bagration, and they had a major rivalry. One of them was, I don't remember which was which, but one of them was for the strategy of scorched earth, just keep running away, drain Napoleon out, and the other one was like, we can't just let him take all this land. It's demoralizing, and the Russian army was facing major morale issues for running away because they didn't know about scorched earth as a tactic. They didn't know how effective it was in the way that their general did. So eventually they were forced to turn around purely to keep the morale of their army up. Because had they given up Moscow without a fight, Alexander could have lost the throne. The army could have completely went into mutiny. So it was a good call by Russia despite them losing the Battle of Borodino.
Prisoners immediately and tell them to burn it to the ground. Well, well, Jimmy the Arsonist, you are not going to believe
Jimmy
your
the
luck.
Arsonist.
Moscow went up in flames, and as Napoleon entered, it became very clear his army wouldn't be able to stay there very long. But he had just defeated the Russian army and taken their most beloved city. In his mind, he had won. So he sent Tsar Alexander in St. Petersburg a letter. Your Imperial Majesty, Napoleon requests your surrender. How shall I respond? You shan't, Dmitri. Ever? Ever. But, Your Majesty, it will be winter soon. The French forces are stuck 500 miles into Russian territory with dwindling supplies. If we don't say anything, well, then they'll all die. Oh! After waiting for a response for about a month, the first snow of winter began to fall, and Napoleon sensed the catastrophe that was about to unfold. He decided their only choice now was to get out. And that's when it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. His glorious invasion had just become a race for survival. As the Russians realized the French were fleeing for their lives, they began to close in on their supply line. Men froze to death, their horses as well. There was starvation and disease. The injured and dying could only be left by the side of the road, as it was too slow to try to carry them. And all along the way, the dreaded Russian Cossacks stalked the bleeding French army, and every now and then swept in for a quick attack. Napoleon, fearing capture, kept a violent...
The Russian Cossacks were nothing like any army had ever faced previously. They were like a rogue force. They didn't stick around in these big formations. They were very militia-like in their nature, despite actually being a part of the Russian army. And they were a great match for Napoleon and the Grande Armée's cavalry in a way that no other country was able to match it.
around his neck. At one point, the Russian armies nearly trapped him against the Berezina River, but a little Napoleon cleverness gave him the old Geoffrey juke, tricking them into thinking he was going south and then escaping across rapidly built pontoon bridges to the north. When the Russians realized where he was and began to close in, the French burned the bridges before everyone could cross. Hundreds drowned, and thousands were captured. At this point, Napoleon got wind of plots against him forming in Paris, so he abandoned his men and went back to France. The remaining French stragglers made it across the border. It's been estimated over 600,000 men went into Russia.
So you could see, not to say that the retreat was insignificant, but he definitely lost a lot less men during the retreat than the approach.
100,000 returned. Napoleon was now in a very precarious situation. His army had just been obliterated, and the other European leaders smelled blood. Here was an opportunity to take advantage of a weakened Napoleon, regain territory and influence, and liberate Europe from his dirty French paws. And so, they began to turn. Prussia soon broke their alliance and switched sides, while Austria declared neutrality. Even Sweden, led by one of Napoleon's old marshals, joined the Allies, partly due to Napoleon's earlier invasion of Swedish Pomerania.
Don't know why
of the
Napoleon
Sixth
did that.
Coalition
That was a really stupid idea.
had begun. The coalition forces had been reforming their armies, and they were now much better. And the UK had also significantly amped up its financial aid to its continental allies. Their armies quickly advanced through Poland and into Germany. In Paris, Napoleon was understandably freaking out. He needed to put together a new army fast, and he called up over 100,000 new conscripts, mostly teenagers. He also put his factories into overdrive, and he was like, "You, make more rifles. You, build new cannons. You, make more horses. I don't make horses. Then who makes horses? Horses make horses. Explain how." "Well, when a daddy horse and a mommy horse love each other very much." "Yes, go on." "Well, then the daddy horse..." "I'm sorry, Napoleon. You're 43. I thought you'd know this stuff." "Don't touch me. I'm gonna be sick." As it turned out, Napoleon's lack of horses would take the biggest toll on his army, since his tactics relied on speed, maneuverability, and destruction. When he took the fight to the Allies in 1813, he did defeat them and sent them running. But lacking cavalry, he was unable to effectively pursue and destroy. He needed horses. For the Allies, being defeated in battle by a man whose army was now full of inexperienced conscripts was concerning. So both sides were like, hold up, time out. The Allies were somewhat cornered, and had Napoleon kept going, it's possible he could have won. But instead he agreed to a brief truce with the Austrians mediating between the two sides. When Austria demanded Napoleon make major concessions, Napoleon told them to shove it. Having had their terms rejected, Austria felt now they were justified in saying, well, we tried, and they joined the coalition.
It was more difficult for Austria to join the coalition because Francis had just had his daughter marry Napoleon, so it was a very difficult thing for Austria to do. But eventually, they realized that it would be more advantageous for them to go against Napoleon rather than against the rest of the coalition.
Look at us. The boys are back together, but Napoleon is still dangerous, so we need a plan. Any ideas? Ooh, I know. No, forget it. That's stupid. No. I've got it! When he approaches, we run away. Genius. He's a genius. The plan was as follows. Wherever Napoleon advanced, whoever he advanced on would avoid battle, allowing the others to sweep in from the sides and attack the French marshals guarding his flanks. Essentially, the plan was, don't try to fight Napoleon. And this plan worked tremendously. The Allies scored a number of victories that saw Napoleon move back to the city of Leipzig, where he would make one last major stand as the Allied armies converged in on him from all sides. The stage was set for the biggest and bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Leipzig. Almost 500,000 troops from over a dozen nations.
You can tell based on the formation here on this map and how Napoleon is essentially surrounded that this battle probably isn't going to go well for him. Despite the logistics of this battle and having multiple armies against him, Napoleon still almost won the Battle of Leipzig. Just didn't happen to go his way.
Stretched across the battlefield, the French found themselves fighting on all sides for 4 days against the Austrians, Prussians, Swedes, and Russians. It's no wonder this battle is also sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Nations. The French fought ferociously, but ultimately were no match for the coordinated efforts of the coalition. At one point, in the midst of battle, Saxon troops allied with the French had a team huddle and were like, hey guys, I'm pretty sure the French are losing. Let's switch sides. And so they did. When it became clear that Napoleon couldn't win, he ordered a retreat across the only bridge over the river. The Allies swarmed into the city, and desperate fighting raged in the streets. Okay, Corporal, after everyone has crossed the river, I need you to blow up the bridge. Okay? Not before everyone's crossed, after. You got that? Yes, Colonel, I'm not 5. I can comprehend time. Good. Wait, did he say before or after? Well, fortune favors the bold. The bridge was blown early, and 30,000 French troops were stranded and captured.
Not only 30,000 French troops, but multiple of Napoleon's marshals were actually stranded on the opposite side of the river, and they got trapped, one of which was Marshal Poniatowski, the only Polish-born French marshal that existed in Napoleon's army. He tried to flee over the river on his horse, and it knocked him off, and he drowned. Marshal MacDonald, who I mentioned in the previous video as being an ally of Monroe, was one of Napoleon's most outspoken marshals. He literally got the name, his outspokenness, from King Louis XVIII, who ended up being restored to the British throne, or to the French throne, after Napoleon was defeated. He also got caught on the opposite side, and he gives his account of how he got over the river and how he almost lost his life as well. So it was a catastrophic error for the French to blow up the bridge too soon. And when you have these catastrophic errors on top of even bigger errors back in Russia in the Peninsular War, time was running out for Napoleon.
Disaster. And with that, the dominoes were beginning to come crashing down on Napoleon. In the south, an army under the British Duke of Wellington had been pushing the French out of Spain for the past few years, and were now...
At the Battle of Salamanca, Wellington defeated one of Napoleon's youngest marshals, who was named Marshal Marmont. Marmont actually was the military leader in Paris in the French Revolution of 1830 that ended up overthrowing the Bourbons again, and that's when King Louis Philippe got put on the throne. And Marmont was a smart marshal. He was very good, but Wellington just outclassed him. Marmont and him were having basically this running contest on the river. Marmont made a misstep, and Wellington capitalized on it. At Victoria, I believe he defeated Marshal Jourdan and Napoleon's brother Joseph, and that ended up losing Napoleon control of Spain. Marshal Chousey, another one of Napoleon's marshals, probably the best one in terms of actually being a general in independent command, kept Wellington and the forces outside of France. So Wellington, for the rest of this time, from 1813 all the way to Napoleon being defeated in 1814, was not able to cross into the French frontier, though. So that was about as far as he would get.
Into France. Austrian armies had pushed into Italy, while Napoleon's old flamboyant cavalry commander, Murat, who Napoleon had made king of Naples, decided to switch sides. German states, many resentful after years under Napoleon's thumb, turned against him, and the Confederation of the Rhine collapsed. Bernadotte invaded Denmark, and they were forced to join the coalition, while the Netherlands were liberated. You'd think Napoleon might have seen the writing on the wall, but he was Napoleon, and so instead, he prepared to keep fighting. As attitudes in Paris were already beginning to turn against him, he called up more conscripts to defend the exhausted nation. As for the Allies, they weren't sure exactly what they were aiming for here. A few peace offers were floated that may have let Napoleon keep his position, but the British kept throwing around even more money, and eventually, they all agreed that the ultimate aim was...
One of the best peace offerings that Napoleon got was the Frankfurt proposal, which actually would have allowed him to remain as Emperor of France, and the borders would have went back to, I want to say, 1802, prior to the wars of the Third and Fourth Coalition. That would have been Napoleon's best possible path, but he kept delaying the negotiations. He thought if he delayed him enough time that he would be able to raise more men and be able to fight. Major miscalculation by Napoleon. And earlier they mentioned that Marshal Murat, who was Napoleon's best cavalry commander, saved his army at the Battle of Eylau, ended up turning on Napoleon. That was a major miscalculation by Murat, because later on he realized that the Allies weren't going to let him keep his throne after Napoleon was defeated. So after Napoleon came back for the 100 Days campaign, Murat attempted to go against the coalition. He took 30,000 men and tried to go to war with the coalition. He ended up losing and eventually was executed.
Deposition of Napoleon entirely. And so, Napoleon embarked on one of his most famous campaigns to defend the homeland. He was completely outnumbered, but the Allied armies had split up and spread out. His army was so small that he could move at lightning speed, and he used this to his advantage. In the famous 6 Days campaign against Prussian General Blücher, he attacked from all directions and defeated Blücher's forces 4 times, only suffering a tenth of the casualties.
Look at those
he
casualty
inflicted,
numbers.
even
That's
with his
insane.
back completely to the wall. Napoleon was still Napoleon. Then he turned south to take on Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia and enjoyed even more victories. However, Napoleon's problem was that he couldn't be everywhere at once, and wherever he wasn't, the Allies continued to push towards Paris. He made one last-ditch attempt at moving in behind the enemy lines and cutting off their communications, but Paris was in disarray, and the people were sick of war. One ambitious and slightly treacherous politician sent the Allied armies a letter basically saying, "Hey,
I'm surprised this is the first time we've heard about Talleyrand in this entire video. Talleyrand is extremely interesting. He was actually a part of the French royal government before Napoleon, helped Napoleon stage the coup, became Napoleon's foreign minister. If you look up British propaganda on Napoleon, you will see Talleyrand featured in that propaganda. Eventually, he sends this telegram to the Allies, betrays them, and actually becomes the negotiating party for France at the Congress of Vienna. So Talleyrand has almost as interesting of a story as Napoleon. He was a very good politician, and he went with wherever the political wind was blowing.
come on in." And so, they did. The city's defenders surrendered, and as the Allied leaders entered Paris, the people cheered them as bringers of peace. Paris had fallen. "Quick, marshals, gather your men. We're gonna launch an assault on Paris." "Where are my marshals?" "They all left and told me to give you this note." Napoleon's marshals had realized what he hadn't. It was over, and they insisted all that was left now, for the good of France, was for him to abdicate, and without the support of his army.
That's where the movie Waterloo starts, with Napoleon's marshals confronting him about the reality of his situation, which included Ney, MacDonald, a few other marshals. They confronted Napoleon about the reality of his situations, and that's the only scene from Waterloo that I've actually seen myself. That's still a movie that I want to see, and that might be one of the, maybe even the very next video that I do after we finish this Oversimplified series, of course.
Napoleon had no choice. He hoped his son could take his place, but it was decided instead to restore the old Bourbon monarchy.
Alexander actually pushed for Napoleon's son, Napoleon II, who was only like 2 or 3 years old, to be put as the ruler of France because he hated the Bourbon monarchy. The Bourbon monarchy had always allied with not Russia. They allied with Austria and Prussia, which Alexander thought was a personal thing. In reality, it was just geography. So he pushed for Bernadotte to become the ruler of France, as well as Napoleon's son. The other allies in the coalition shot down the Bernadotte idea because they thought that he would basically be a Napoleon puppet. I'm not sure why they thought that, because Bernadotte always went against Napoleon. But ultimately, the British were the main pushers for the Bourbon monarchy to be pursued, or to be put back in power. Austria and Prussia agreed, so that's what happened.
King Louis XVI's brother would become the King of France. It was almost like the French Revolution had never even happened. But what will we do with Napoleon? We can't have a hyperactive 44-year-old menace running around reigniting revolutionary ideals and plotting his return. Well, why don't we send him, I don't know, there. The location chosen for Napoleon's exile was the small island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. Napoleon was to rule over the island, and even got to keep the title Emperor of Elba. The Allies must have been in stitches when they came up with that. When he learned what his fate was to be, he drank the poison he had been keeping around his neck. But it had gone out of date, so instead of a quick and painless death, he got a painful stummy-wummy instead. Before he left France, he addressed his oldest and closest guard one last time, making an emotional speech that ended with him kissing their flag. And off he went to exile. The deal that was given to him was actually quite generous. His family were given titles, he was to receive a state pension from France, and he was able to receive many distinguished visitors, all eager to come and meet the famed emperor.
The 100 Days campaign that led to Waterloo and Napoleon's ultimate defeat is extremely militaristically interesting and a great moment in history. And obviously it led to the movie Waterloo, so that's great. But it was a major miscalculation by Napoleon. And in retrospect, I kind of wish he didn't do it, because he probably would have lived longer. And if Napoleon didn't decide to drink the poison, I think that might have accelerated his stomach cancer, which resulted in him dying shortly thereafter. This whole ordeal ended only 6 years later in 1821.
Ruled over Elba well, improving infrastructure and introducing many legal and social reforms aimed at improving life on the island. Hey, Napoleon, just coming in to check on how it's all going. Holy smokes! But it wasn't all good.
He did pass a
For
lot
one
of good
thing,
laws in
He learned
Elba.
of the death of his first wife, Josephine, and was deeply saddened. He was forbidden from seeing his son and current wife, and in Austria, Emperor Francis had ordered a local count to seduce her, so she would forget about Napoleon. Then, the new King Louis XVIII refused to give Napoleon his agreed pension. He was under constant threat of assassination, and there were even rumors that the Allies were thinking of relocating him somewhere even more remote. But the biggest problem was that Napoleon was once the master of Europe. He had lived a thrilling life of adventure, fame, and glory. Now, he found himself on a tiny island in the Mediterranean, and he was bored. Wouldn't it be nice if he could somehow return to France and reclaim his throne? Hey, Napoleon, want to go back to France and reclaim your throne? I would, Pierre. But how? Well, I was thinking we could just take this boat. Will that work? Surprisingly, yes. Pierre, remember when I told you-
Napoleon going back to France should not have worked. That should never have worked. But it was poor planning by the Russians to give him the position of Emperor of Elba, allow him to raise a very small army, and it allowed Napoleon to just take a boat back and basically reclaim France.
would ever kiss you? Yes, sire. Well, pucker up, boyo. Yay. When Napoleon left Elba, it wasn't really the daring escape you might think. He basically had kind of a leaving ceremony, hopped on a ship, and sailed back to France. He brought with him an army of about 1,000 men, and he began his journey to Paris. However, in Paris, there was now a new king, and at first, the people largely accepted him because the last few years of war under Napoleon had brought immense death and economic suffering. That's right, the king is back, baby. Divine right to rule. Don't worry, everyone. I know the economy is kaput, but I and my courtiers will withdraw into this palace, and we will definitely work as hard as we can to fix everything. Oh yeah, that's why we got rid of the king. As the Bourbon monarchy began to look more and more like a return to the past, and the returning nobility seemed hellbent on regaining their lost privileges, the people weren't too happy. And so, Napoleon hoped that his glorious return would be met with jubilation. In the end, the reaction was a little mixed, but many were happy to see their old emperor. Your Majesty, it seems that Napoleon
I would
is
say
back
it was
and marching
slightly
this way
more
with-
favorable than it wasn't, because even the peasants that didn't like Napoleon and the common people that didn't like Napoleon had to realize that their lives and their privileges were better under Napoleon and a more equal system. Despite him being a dictator, the actual French system of jobs and politics and military was a hell of a lot more equal than it was under the Bourbons ever.
1,000 men. That guy? No problem. I have hundreds of thousands of men. Send them to arrest him. Your Majesty, it seems the thousands of men we sent to arrest Napoleon have all joined his side.
King Louis XVIII was an idiot. He sent Napoleon's former men after he made reforms to the army to make it worse and lower their pay. Sent his army to Napoleon, Napoleon's former army, and of course they all took his side. There's a great scene in Waterloo that I've seen clips of where Marshal Ney is actually the one who confronts Napoleon, and Napoleon goes, he puts out his arms and he's like, if any of you wish to strike down your emperor, do it now. And the army ends up, joining Napoleon. They were won over, and that was the end of King Louis in France.
Well, I'm off to Belgium. If you ever need a king again, be sure to let me know. As Napoleon continued his journey, the king had sent battalions of men to stop him, but they largely comprised of Napoleon's old soldiers, many unhappy with King Louis's military reforms.
Exactly.
And so, when ordered to arrest him, they simply couldn't do it. In one famous incident, the troops began to cry out, "Long live the emperor." When Napoleon reached Paris, with King Louis having fled, he entered unopposed to reclaim his throne. Napoleon was back from the dead. Okay, everyone, now that we've finally gotten rid of that guy, let's try to make sure something like this can never happen again. What's that doing there? Hey, fellow monarchs. This time, Napoleon promised he would be a mucho good boy and not start any wars. But the Allied leaders were having none of it. They declared Napoleon an outlaw and the illegitimate ruler of France. Then, they declared war. Not on France, but on Napoleon himself. And when you have multiple empires...
What a G. The War of the Seventh Coalition isn't fucking the UK. I didn't mean to swear. The War of the Seven Coalition isn't the United Kingdom, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and basically every country in Europe versus France. It's every country in Europe versus the man, Napoleon Bonaparte. And because the coalition did this, I think this is the reason that almost makes it to where I'm happy Napoleon did go for the 100 Days campaign, because it solidified his legacy. Never in the history of Europe, in the history of the world, has almost an entire continent declared war on not a country, but one man.
Declaring war on you as an individual, that's how you know you're a very naughty boy. The Allied powers began making plans to combine their forces and once again invade France. The most immediate threat to Napoleon were the British and Prussians hanging out in nearby Belgium. If Napoleon could knock them out quickly, maybe he could force the Allies to negotiate, and maybe he could hold on to his power. Together, the two armies to the north
but probably
outnumbered him,
not.
so he made a plan to divide them and take them on separately. Historians debate how much of a chance Napoleon had here, but this same strategy of dividing and conquering had worked for him multiple times. He marched north with 125,000 men.
It could have worked. Napoleon almost did win Waterloo. It was very close. But the problem is even if Napoleon did win at Waterloo, the other coalition armies were never going to sue for peace. They couldn't do that, because even if one country wanted to, like let's say Austria wanted to sue for peace, the other countries in that coalition would not allow it. So even if Napoleon won Waterloo, people like to look at Waterloo as the moment Napoleon was finally defeated. Napoleon was well defeated before Waterloo. Waterloo was just the nail in the coffin.
On the Allies in a number of initial engagements, defeating the Prussians before turning to take on the British. But to Napoleon's dismay, miscommunication and hesitation among his marshals allowed both enemy armies to retreat. And crucially, rather than fleeing east, the Prussians moved north, where they could remain in contact with the British. Napoleon sent a force to hold off the Prussians as he moved in on the British, now holding a defensive position at Waterloo. Prussian General Blücher sent word that he would come to Wellington's aid if he could just hold off the French for long enough.
And the reason that Blücher and the Prussians were able to come to Wellington's aid, sorry, I can't talk. Excuse me. It was Napoleon's newly appointed Marshal, Marshal Grouchy, who was an amazing general throughout the campaigns. But in this instance, he got distracted fighting the Prussian rear guard, and he thought he was pursuing the Prussian army. Meanwhile, the rest of the Prussian army, minus the rear guard, was able to come and help Wellington.
Napoleon had to defeat Wellington before the Prussian army could arrive in force, and it was close. The British held the high ground and a number of key defensive buildings across the battlefield. After waiting some hours he didn't have for the ground to dry, Napoleon sent men to assault the Hougoumont farm, but the British-German garrison there held out. French Marshal Ney launched a number of miscalculated cavalry charges at the British lines. The British formed defensive square formations, and they...
Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's best marshals, not the best field commander when it came to cavalry and actually leading a battle. Napoleon's chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, had been either thrown out of a window or fell out of a window a year or two prior. Had Marshal Berthier been in charge and been Napoleon's chief of staff in this battle, Napoleon probably does win Waterloo. If Marshal Ney doesn't make this mistake, and he thinks that the British are retreating because they step back on the hill. He thinks they're retreating and they launch a cavalry charge that went disastrously for Marshal Ney and the French army. If Ney doesn't make that mistake, Napoleon probably wins Waterloo. If Grouchy realizes that he's chasing the Prussian rearguard instead of the full Prussian army and comes to help Napoleon, Napoleon probably wins Waterloo. But none of these things happened. It was a lot of coordinated mistakes that resulted in Napoleon losing Waterloo. But even if everything went right, everything with Grouchy and Ney and Berthier and everything went right, it doesn't really matter. Napoleon's army and Napoleon's France was at its wits' end. The coalition had over 1,000,000 men ready to invade France from multiple different armies that would come in from multiple different angles. Even if Napoleon won Waterloo, we would have seen something similar to 1814, where there's multiple other armies coming in and Napoleon would have to go back and forth and they'd make their way to Paris again, and basically the same thing would happen.
French cavalry to shreds, while one guy chose the absolute worst time to go on a bender. The French did manage to capture a farmhouse directly in front of the British line, and from there, they unleashed artillery hellfire on the British square formations. And as Napoleon sent his Imperial Guard in to finish the British off, a nervous Wellington knew his lines were at breaking point. But the Prussians had earlier begun to arrive, and now they were arriving in large numbers. And after the British held out and sent the French Imperial Guard running, the French lines panicked, fearing they had been encircled, and they began to flee.
Wellington and the British sending the Imperial Guard running was extremely important. That was Napoleon's old guard. Those were his best veterans, his best grenadiers. And when the British sent them running, they had a reputation, the Imperial Guard, they had a reputation for being immortal and being able to accomplish anything. So when the rest of the French army, which was mostly young conscripts, seen this immortal unit get defeated like that, it scared everybody else, and it completely just crippled the army.
Battle of Waterloo was an Allied victory. And with that, Napoleon's hopes of returning to glory were vanquished. He knew he was defeated. He went to the British and said, "Can I please have a house near London?" And the British replied, "No." Instead, to make sure Napoleon was put away once and for all, they sent him to one of the most isolated and remote places they could think of. A tiny island in the Atlantic Ocean, St. Helena.
Can't even
Here,
see
a
it.
deeply isolated and depressed Emperor Napoleon would live the remaining years of his life. His house was a wooden bungalow, not exactly on par with the Tuileries Palace. Much to his frustration,
Still looked
his
pretty
captors
nice.
referred to him as general, rather than calling him emperor. His mail was censored, his visitors were vetted. There was almost no way he could escape such an isolated island. But just to be sure, he was guarded by 2,000 British soldiers and 2 ships that circled the island 24 hours a day. He had once been the most powerful man alive.
If you couldn't tell, the
and
British
images
hated
of
him.
the victorious Napoleon depict a strong leader, hand firmly in jacket. Depictions of Napoleon on St. Helena show a disheveled old man, hand firmly in pants. He had lost everything. And by the way, he was only 46, so maybe it's about
Wow,
time
dude. All that adventure, from ruling Europe to being exiled to coming back from exile, all the way, all of it that Napoleon accomplished from age 24 to 46. That's extremely young.
You know what? You're doing all right, kid. Napoleon fought one last battle while on the island. The battle for his reputation. He spent hours writing his memoirs, espousing his achievements, recording his greatness, and turning himself and his story into a phenomenal legend. And in this battle, he certainly succeeded. His mark on history cannot be denied. After his defeat, the European monarchs had got to work restoring Europe to its traditional balance and reasserting their dominance. But after Napoleon had spread the influence of the French Revolution, these returning monarchs would have a difficult time regaining their absolute control. France returned to the rule of the Bourbons, but it would go on to stage another revolution.
The Revolution
then
of
another one.
1830 and then
Reaction
in
to Napoleon's
1848. And the revolution in 1848 actually led to Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew to his brother Louis, getting on the French throne, where he would rule for over 20 years. So Napoleon's legacy did live on, although not through his direct lineage. And yeah, ultimately, most of Europe went through revolutions in 1848 and turned into republics, and the entire system of the European map completely changed in the Congress of Vienna, which was masterminded by the Austrian Metternich for the most part. And that system held out basically until World War I, with the exception of the Franco-Prussian War and the I don't know what they called the war between Austria and Prussia prior to the Franco-Prussian War. But Prussia under Otto von Bismarck rose to power. And that was really the only thing that changed with the map, was a united Germany. All these little states that you see up near the top of the map ended up basically becoming one giant country. And that led to what we had with World War I.
in places like Germany and Italy, propelled forward the ideas and feelings of modern unity and nationalism, and his Napoleonic Code still remains the basis of law in various modern countries. The modern world owes a lot to Napoleon's legacy. He remains statistically possibly the greatest military general in history, and his revolutionary military tactics changed the face of warfare. He was the last truly great leader to both lead his armies in battle while retaining total political control over a vast empire. There's still hope for Joe Biden, but the man remains somewhat of an enigma, and we still aren't sure exactly what to make of him in some regards. Was he the champion of the French Revolution, spreading equality wherever he went, or did he betray it by making himself an absolute monarch and restricting certain liberties? Was he an ambitious and aggressive conqueror, hell-bent on bringing Europe to its knees? Or was he simply defending himself against an aggressive Europe, hell-bent?
I think the true answer to this question could be found in a gray area. Nothing is black and white in history, and that's why I believe most people who are interested in history don't fully identify with either political party. They have problems with both, because the reality of history is that most things lie in a gray area. I tend to lean more on the side that Napoleon was defending himself. I don't think that he wanted to be a tyrant. I don't think he wanted to betray the ideas of the revolution. But when you think about Napoleon's actions, most of them seem reasonable. You could justify reasons for it. Once again, if you look at the wars of the First and Second Coalition, they started before Napoleon was first consul. So you can't blame him for those wars. He wasn't even the leader of France yet. The War of the Third and Fourth Coalition, the Third Coalition started because Britain started pumping a lot of money to other countries, and they all declared war on Napoleon due to the British money and the fact that they didn't like the revolutionary ideals. So they were determined to crush the revolution. Napoleon won that war. As soon as he wins that war, Prussia declares war on him for no other reason than some territory that Napoleon established. They wanted to give Hanover to the British, and that was enough for Prussia to declare war. Napoleon beats Prussia. I think the reason that people see Napoleon as an aggressor is because in these wars where other countries declared war on him, instead of sitting back and fighting a defensive war, Napoleon took to the offensive, which started the whole cult of the offensive thing that remained all the way into World War I, where countries felt the need that they had to attack first, which is why in World War I you had the Russians mobilizing and then the Germans had to mobilize because everybody wanted to get to the battlefield first because they thought there was a major advantage in offense. Little did they know World War I would start trench warfare, and it was a defensive war, but we're getting way off track. So I lean on the side that Napoleon was not the aggressor, but rather the victim of an aggressive Europe. That's about it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below of Napoleon's legacy. And also let me know what you think of this video. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace out.